there anything else, Kirti, you want me to know?
I just wanted to know if I can show some images. I think I will be able to share the screen, right?
Yes, other people have done on
Perfect.
Monday, so that should be okay, shouldn't it, Kamaya?
Great.
Yes, you can share anything that you want, any PPT, anything. It's all allowed. You'll find all the options in the bottom of the screen.
But what will help very much if you have something to show, if you could send it over to Kemia just now, because in case there is any problem, then it's easier to do it centrally.
You can just mail it to me. In case if you couldn't present it, then I can. So I stay there as a backup anyways. So if you're not able to present it, I think which won't be the case though. But in case if you're not, then I can present it. But it's better if you do, so you have the hang of it, when to change something or, when you're talking about it.
That is an emergency only.
Yes.
I don't see Somsuk has joined us as yet.
Geoff, any idea how many people do we have at the moment?
Well, I've got 18 people listed, which is quite a lot to get through. And obviously, I'm hoping everyone will be, fairly tight, 5-10 minutes, 10 minutes maximum. Hopefully, people.
10 minutes. 10 minutes is 10 minutes is 180 minutes.
Yeah, true. But I think obviously we don't want things. If people can keep their points as briefly and clearly as possible, that helps a lot. And what I'll do is, if you like, after you've opened things, Kirti, I'll say a few words and then invite various people. I had got Somsuk down earlier with Mike simply because of the time zone difference. I know it's very late in Thailand and
you don't need to kind of make an introductory statement.
But well, no, but I could invite Somsuk if she's here, but obviously if not, then Mike's ready to go, which is great. And then Forbes is due to present, and so is Mike. So we've got quite a few people ready to go as soon as they log in. I see Janice has joined us, which is great.
So did I hear you correct?
Good to see you, Janice.
Geoff, you don't want did you say that you didn't want me to kind of do this introductory statement?
Yeah, sure. But in terms of the proposal we're having going forward, we could leave that to the end, perhaps.
Yeah, that would be certainly there.
Yeah,
that's certainly what we have.
Yeah, no, that's great. We seem to be getting more people coming in now. So we could just wait another minute or two if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure lots of people are trying to get in. It's very thrilling. No one wants to miss it.
Yeah.
I'm going to get some
here as well. What's the time where you are, Janice?
Oh, it's 10:30, exactly 10:30 in the morning.
All right, so a very nice time of the morning for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I thought we were 5 hours apart. So yesterday I came in at 9:30, but then I realized that we're for another few days, we're only 4 hours apart.
Yeah,
so,
well, the clocks went back in the UK on Sunday, so I was worried that people would be logging in an hour early or an hour late, but everything worked out fine. Good to see you, Forbes.
Hi, nice to see you.
This is like a reunion of old.
It is, isn't it?
Reunion of friends.
If only we could all be in the same place and able to share a drink and something to eat as well. But
I think we should raise funds to have this a Festschrift in person, and we should have it in Glasgow or someplace really symbolic.
Glasgow sounds very good.
Glasgow, that would suit Forbes, wouldn't it?
And then everybody could get, the people who have still have academic privileges could get there on their academic thing, and the rest could come on frequent flyers, and we could all have a wonderful time and listen to each other and laugh and have a party.
Good idea.
Fantastic.
Kimia, are we ready to start? It's already 8 and
Yes, Kirti ji, we have some 12 participants, I guess. If that works for you, we can start talking.
shall we wait for a little longer?
Maybe
No,
we
we
can
have-
wait for a
Yeah,
minute.
give a couple of minutes, I think.
Yeah,
People
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe-
Remember, it's Latin Americanists. On time would be 15 minutes. They would be perfectly on time.
Noted.
In India, it is not very different. I must tell you, Janice.
It's very good to see you. Okay, I'm going to get something.
While we're waiting, it was funny because when a few of us started this network association for urban research in the urban south in the 1980s, we did have meetings from one city to another in Europe. And we found that after a couple of drinks, we all started conforming to our national stereotypes, which was absolutely hilarious. I see Deshpande is here as well. And numbers are coming in there. Did you get my message, my email, Forbes?
Which one?
I sent you an email about an hour or two ago. The only reason I mention it
Oh,
is
about the change in order.
the sequence. It may not apply, I don't know. But it was the first email ever typed and sent by my 3-year-old grandson.
Ah,
So he's already on the system. Yeah.
Deshpande Saab, good to see you. Thank you.
Good morning, Kirti ji. How are you?
Thank you very much.
I'm in USA.
I know Anita told me today that you're there.
Yeah.
You wanted me to send you this link, which we have. And I'm glad you're there.
Well, do you want to start, Kirti?
Yes,
And,
okay, let's start. Is it okay, Kimia, to start?
Yes, Kirti ji, you can start. Everybody can start.
And I understand you're recording it, right?
Yes, yes. It's been recording since 8, so not to worry. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well-
Friends, colleagues, welcome to the second session on remembering John Turner. As you know, we had a session on Monday, and this is the second one. John, as we know, was the architect who in 70s, 80s, and 90s talked an unarchitectural language. He spoke about people and communities, not just the buildings. He talked not monuments and monument making, but housing. Housing of common people, housing of poor people, housing of slum dwellers, and settlement of the marginal groups. And he saw people not only as consumers, not only as end users of housing, but as producers of housing, as designers, as builders, as makers, as financiers of housing. And he did not talk about rich people. He talked about ordinary, talked about common people, poor people who lived in slums and lived in self-made housing, in self-made settlements, in self-made living spaces, which were seen by authorities and even upper class, I think, people in our cities as unauthorized, as encroachment, as problem areas. John redefined the problem, and he called slums a solution, and talked about poor people's ability to create them as energy, as creativity, and as resource. His was a bottom-up perspective of housing. And he saw the matter of housing production not from the viewpoint of the intermediary, but from the viewpoint of the people who used them, who made them, and who were responsible for their coming up. Now, that is, there are lots of people talked about yesterday, and I'll take long on that, but just wanted to say that we had about 30 people yesterday, and most of them were his generation people who either worked with him or knew him or were inspired by his work. They analyzed impact of his work. They paid tribute to his genius. They remembered him. They told stories and shared anecdotes. And of course, brought him back among us for that particular hour. We today have about, I don't know how many, but about 20 people. And as experience goes of day before, in the next few minutes, many more will join. So I'm not sure if we'll be able to do justice, but at the contingent plan, we have Geoff and I thought that in case we are not able to take care of everyone who's here who wants to speak, we'll probably extend this meeting one more day, and tentatively we suggested 3rd of November to continue this discussion. If we are not able to finish it today, we will talk about it at the end of this session in terms of how many have been left out and how many have not been able to cover. I also, before Geoff takes over and invites people to speak, I also wanted to say that we have some very specific suggestions to discuss in terms of how to take this particular event, this particular happening ahead into the future. And we want to discuss them at the end of the session. So please stay back. They're very important ideas, and we're going to require your input. So that's sort of a brief introduction. I request Geoff to take over and invite our friends to remember John and talk about his legacy. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Kirti, and on behalf of on behalf of everybody, I think it's a great initiative that you've started on this. And just by way of linking the previous webinar to this one, for those who didn't join the previous one of the things that came up then was very much John's understanding of power relations, as Kirti indicated. Instead of looking at things in conventional political terms of left-wing or right-wing, he looked very much in terms of top-down or bottom-up. And as we all know, was a very strong advocate of bottom-up development. One thing that I was left thinking at the end of the first one is, was the 1960s and 70s a golden period for community-led development? The work that John did in Peru and I saw in Turkey was a time when it was possible for people to occupy public land, build housing, build settlements, build communities. But with the development of market forces and the development of state influence over markets with the private sector, it does seem as though the options for that are very much, well, certainly very, very different. So while we give immense recognition and appreciation to the work of John, I think the issue of community-led development in the contemporary situation is something that hopefully we can pick up on later. But to get the session going now, I'd very much like to invite Mike Slingsby, please, to make a contribution. Mike,
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Is my voice loud and clear?
Yep, very good.
Yes. Okay, great. Yeah, I would like to give a rather general introduction to the experiences of reading, first of all, meeting and later reading John and how it has influenced my work. And bearing in mind that I left England in 1975, and I haven't been there for any substantial period of time since then. And I've been in Asia all of this time. And I'm in Phnom Penh because I have a connection that goes back to 1973, where we had over 3 years, 11 town planning students at what was then the DPU. And unfortunately, they went back at the time of the Khmer Rouge, and 9 out of those 11 were killed. So it was a very sad period of time also. But I actually worked here for 4 years from 96 to 2000, and have come back on a sort of a retirement visa, and still find it's very interesting to be in Phnom Penh and to see the situation here. I first met John when he just came back from Peru in the early 70s. I can't remember the exact date. It may be when the DPU wasn't the DPU, but it was part of the AA. And he had organized a series of seminars explaining his experiences, but also bringing in some new words into the development dictionary, and sometimes we found him quite difficult to understand, if I'm frank. But this of course led us to delve much more into his work and to his books and so on. So we learned about footholders, we learned about consolidators and so on, which was all fairly new to us at that time. And I think thanks to Otto Koningsberger and Pat Wakely and others who organized those seminars. But the part of his work which I feel most strongly and relevant about is this whole issue of housing as a verb. Housing as an activity, not just as producing, as a noun, just producing a house. And the process of people either directly constructing or managing the construction of their house not only got them a place to live, but psychologically had quite a dramatic change. People felt that if we've been able to build a house, then all the other problems that we face in life are quite small and we can manage them. Because getting our own house was the biggest challenge. And if we've been able to organize land and finance and building materials, and either we have or we've got somebody to build our house, then everything else that we have to deal with in life is relatively small. And so people became very strong in that process. And I hope Somsuk will come soon, because in many ways she's carried forward this idea with the work of ACHR in many Asian countries. So people were able to address issues of getting children in school, of improving their health and so on, from a feeling very strong, because we've got a house that we have been actually involved in. And I think it also brought in a new dimension to what up to then had been seen as traditional slum improvement, which was largely seen as basic infrastructure services, and brought in housing as an important component. And again, this is something that Somsuk took forward and took the whole slum improvement issue up to a new plateau to realize that if you didn't include housing, then really people still felt poor psychologically. Just having access to basic services didn't change them. They still felt we are still slum dwellers. But once housing became part of that process, then people's attitude and strengths in their future development and their children's development began to change. And I think both the work Somsuk did and, of course, what Terry did was very much, John did, was also very much part of this. I think also something lots of other people mentioned in the previous session, he was also a wonderful human being. And I think this is something we should never forget. John always had time for everybody. He was a great encourager of those who wanted to learn, and a great explainer of the work that he had done. There is another also side effect out of this work, and that is these types of projects actually also indirectly turn out to be acting as marriage brokers, particularly in Asia, but I think also in many other parts of the world. People always look for better off families to marry their children to. And the fact that they've got a house and it's got services is one way of urban poor's a very important strategy of getting out of poverty by marrying out of poverty. And I think that the work that John did very much led to this process. After the first country I spent a substantial amount of time in was Sri Lanka, where we started the first so-called, what was called Town and Country Planning Master's course. And that was very much based on students running it as a guided learning program rather than a teaching program. And I brought in John's book as an important component of that. And the students themselves prepared a series of seminars based on his work. And one particular reason for doing that is this was at the time that UNDP was funding a new master plan for Colombo, but they didn't have any town planners. There were only 5 in the country. But there were many foreigners on the UNDP project. And I wanted the students from my course to feel that the education they'd received as a town planner and a master's course was as good as those people who'd come from the States, those people who'd come from England and other countries. And therefore, knowledge of John's thinking and of what is in his book was very important. So they could go and have an equal discussion with the planners who were working on the master plan for what was then Colombo. So John continued to influence my work in other countries, a long time in India and in Bangladesh, in Vietnam and many other Asian countries, and he's made a tremendous impact on the way I think, the way I work, and also the teaching that I've been doing. So very fond memories of John, and it's great that we've had this opportunity to revive our memories and to remember the very, very important books that he wrote. So thank you all very much for giving me a short time to contribute. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Mike. Much appreciated. Could I now invite Forbes Davidson to make his presentation? Forbes, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, my memories of John go back to 1975 when he worked with us in Ismailia in Egypt. At that time I was very fresh to his way of thinking. And the interesting thing at that time was Egypt was also, let's say, having a fresh look at how it should develop. So there was let's say, an appetite for new approaches. But I think the new approaches they expected in Egypt were, let's say, much more what's the latest in British new towns, and maybe not so much the ideas of John. So John, in this particular case, was brought in as a consultant on housing, and we had a very interesting situation where our main counterpart, who was a former Minister of Housing, was very proud of John being there and organized a lecture to the Society of Egyptian Engineers, the end of which there were a lot of quite confused looking people, because really the ideas that John had put forward were not at all the ideas that people were expecting to hear. So we were rather worried about this. But in the end, the Egyptian government did give the support to coming out with these new approaches. I'd just like to show a few slides just to give you an idea of what this situation was. Let me see if it's going to work. Okay, so yeah, Ismailia was in Egypt on this on the Suez Canal, and this work took place just at the end of the war with Israel. So this was the Suez Canal, and this was the Bar-Lev line. Sorry about the noise. So a situation of war, unfortunately, that connects very much with the present time. But we worked on a master plan, and master plans had lots of volumes, and the most important one here was the volume on housing, which explained a totally different approach. And John's contribution had been not so much to come in with answers to say, well, this is the way we did it in Peru, but to come in with questions and talking to people, observing what was happening, studying what people wanted, what they needed, what way did they build, what the barriers were. And from this, coming up with an approach to housing as opposed to a plan for housing. So John's contribution was in volume 8 of one set of the Ismailia Master Plan. But that major thing was, yeah, to say, okay, how do we approach things? When we worked further on this, we worked with, not with John himself, but then a team from MIT of people who had worked with John. And I think I saw Thomas Sudra there. So Thomas was an important member. And in this situation, we took the existing situation where people were building in mud brick houses, and instead of the conventional approach, which was to demolish everything, the idea was to develop a framework where people could build. And examining the way they were already operating. Sorry. Then came up with an approach to say, well, let's build in an incremental way, or not build, but to give the possibilities of building. And I'll just show you quickly, going through time, how things developed in this area. So unlike most projects in Egypt, where finished buildings were placed, in this case, it was only demarcation of a plot and basic infrastructure. So what you're seeing is that an area which started of, say, 40,000 people, and today is something like 120,000 people. What you also have is, let's say, a certain capacity that has been built in Ismailia. The whole idea was, of course, that you demonstrated something and you hoped that national government would say, okay, this is a very good approach, and we will build it into a national housing policy. That never happened. Locally, the approach was fully adopted, and the local government encouraged new areas to be upgraded and some new site and service programs developed. And this took place over more than 10 years. But then there was a change in central government, and the sort of powers which local government had to work in this way were taken away again. And I think from that, one of the very important lessons is that you can do sometimes very good things at a local level, but it's much more difficult to influence the overall policies. So let me just end there. So to me, a very important question is, okay, what do you learn from this? So John had brought his ideas and approach from Peru, and interestingly, in Egypt, you had physically very similar situations. He brought this approach of thinking, listening, and trying to remove barriers, and we could show that really worked. The big challenge, though, is to say, well, okay, but why has that not had a more significant impact on policy? And I think that links a bit to what was being said at the beginning, where, yeah, the whole situation over time has changed. The context of working has changed dramatically. But can we still learn from this? Yeah, I think, say, John, in a way, taught us to think differently and to dare to change. So in certain situations, this can work. But I wonder whether we are still listening enough and learning enough from the situation to be able to sort of take that and continue to make large-scale changes. An interesting thing from Ismailia was that the work we were doing was involved more than 30% of the whole population of the city. So it was a very significant scale. But most things that have happened more recently have been very small scale. Yeah, I think John's, yeah, for me, one of the big things was saying, okay, housing as a verb. So you're thinking about how the whole process works. And the problem now is that housing has become much more of a noun, a product, something to invest in, something to get a profit from, but much less, let's say, housing as a process. So John influenced me also very much over many years of teaching. And I think teaching and education is a really important way of continuing his legacy. But I am concerned if I ask students, well, have you heard of John Turner? and you have a lot of blank faces. I think we have to do more to sort of keep his lessons alive and to make sure that the very important contribution to thinking can continue. So that's what I would like to say. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you, John, for your influence over many years. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Forbes. And as you say, he asked questions rather than gave answers. And I think that's a lesson all of us have tried to take up, and it's really critical. Now, could I invite Michael Cohen to contribute? Michael did so much to establish the importance of urban issues in the World Bank, and was a major influence there, and did masses to take issues forward. Michael, if you'd like to contribute, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's a real pleasure to see so many old friends on screen. We look a little different, but it's really great to see everybody. And I want to thank Jeff and Curti for organizing this. I met John in the fall of 1970. I had just come back from the Ivory Coast and had been where I was doing my dissertation, and basically discovered that the government in the Ivory Coast seemed to be knocking down more houses than building them. And of course, the poor were being displaced to the periphery of the city. And the government had adopted a policy which could be summed up as build big, beautiful, and forever. And this really wasn't very consistent with what we were later going to get into. So I went to MIT in November, actually, November of 1970, to try out my ideas on John, who I hadn't met, but I had heard about. And he was very encouraging. And in a couple of hours, he really placed what I had done in a context that was much wider than I had understood at the time. And that led to a friendship which went on for a long time. When I joined the bank in 1972, the bank had received a request from Senegal and from India and a few other places to consider building sites and service projects and starting something. But the bank really didn't know what it was going to do. And of course, one could argue the bank still doesn't know what it's going to do. But I think one of the issues was that the idea that the process that John was stressing so much, that this could be sort of a central concept in the way we would think about cities, this was really regarded, I think, in a skeptical but eventually accepting way. And so I want to tell a little bit about that story and about John's impact on the process. 30 years later, the bank had projects in 7,000 cities and towns in the developing world. So there was a lot of things going on, and the other donors had financed another 4,000. So in some ways, John's ideas were at the center of what might have been considered one of the great social experiments of the 20th century. You know, how many places, how many experiments did we have that were in so many countries and so many localities with a similar set of objectives, supposedly objective. I'm quite critical now about this, but it was kind of a remarkable contribution. So in June 72, when the bank approved the first the Senegal project, which was a sites and service project for 14,000 people, for 14,000 plots, 140,000 people was the assumption. It was completely out of proportion to what was really supposed to be, what anybody could imagine. the second city of Senegal was supposed to have been built in 3 years. It was ridiculous. The project was not something which was particularly successful. And 10 years later, there were 1,800 plots that were inhabited. The government said the project was a failure, and so did the bank. And I was the guy who was supposed to be supervising this project, and people said he's finished. And in this context, one of the things that's interesting is I was telling this story to New School students in 2005 here in New York. And at one point, a group of students came and said, we want to go visit that project. And I said, really? You really want to go out there? He said, yeah, we want to go see what happened. And what they discovered 35 years later was that there were 500,000 people living on this site, that there were enormous numbers of schools. There were 55 mosque schools. It had the highest school attendance among girls in Senegal. And the place was booming. And we had one water faucet for 100 families, and now every household had its own water. There were lots of buildings, multi-story buildings. And so the question that haunted me then and still does is, how can something which was a failure at one point be such a roaring success 35 years later? And I asked a lot of people, has anybody done evaluation 35 years later? And there were very few examples. Very few examples. And when I read all of I will say, our collective literature, and I've got, many of you are on my bookshelves here in this room, I could say that we didn't really think that way. We didn't think about the long haul on these things. John, so we started this project. If I go back to 75, I had another very, very important conversation with John, because I was in touch with him almost every week for several years. He made a comment in 75. He said, this thing may work at the project level, but we really have what he called the challenge of replicability. He said, what we know is that if this project is successful, maybe in 5 years we'll be able to duplicate it. But in 5 years, we still won't deal with the scale of the problem, the scale of demand for housing and services and infrastructure. So actually, the project-by-project approach will end up projectizing the city, but not solving the problem. And I had some of my French friends were saying in Dakar, you people, you're interested in sites, but you're not understanding land. You don't understand the land market. You don't think about the broader processes. And so John was the person who pushed, even though his ideas, which Forbes just described so well, were so important in thinking at the project level, he was already thinking beyond that. And he was arguing that we really would need another approach. And I think that in his use of components and the whole sort of typology of the way the thing came together, that this was an enormous contribution, which actually we were not both the bank and I would argue our collective profession has not really been able to deal with, because we still at the level of scale, we don't really make enough of a difference. Many of you knew Shiv Ramakrishna, who was in and out of the bank at different times. At one point, I asked Shivram, had any of these projects made any impact in the developing world? And he started laughing at me. And he said, what a presumptuous question. He said, that actually there are only two things from outer space that we can see that human beings have created, the pyramids and the Great Wall of China. And your projects don't approach that significance. So don't take yourself so seriously. And I thought that was a helpful comment, which I think John would have also appreciated in this context. Later at one point, coming back with Shivram from India, going through Heathrow, Shivram was asked by one of these young immigration officers, "What is your profession, sir?" And he looked, and Shivram looked down at this young man and said, "Urban management." And the man said, "Is that possible, sir?" And I thought that was right to the point, right? So that we really needed a certain amount of humility. And when we thought about about all of these things. And I think that on one hand, John was enormously ambitious and innovative in what he suggested that we all think about. And that was really fabulous. And he was also kept being ahead of the game in thinking this. So by the time my colleagues at the bank were beginning to understand projects, he had already given up on projects, and he was thinking, well, no, now it's the challenge of replicability and how do we reach more scale? And he said, maybe, I remember one day he said, Michael, maybe the idea would just be to provide a lot of building materials and just leave it at that. You know, just provide the building materials. The people will take care of their own solutions. They don't need to be told things, you know, from faraway institutions that aren't on the ground at all. So I think that he was always way ahead of his time, and it was a very important interaction with him. When I think back now, after having left the bank 25 years ago, I realize that to have ideas which are so powerful as to shape the behaviors of one of these big institutions was really quite an extraordinary gift that John had. And so many people ended up behaving and following through. Many of his MIT students, people like Praful Patel and George Gattoni and Philippe Inez and many others from many countries, and some of you may have worked with these people, they all were his students, were his followers. And so I'm happy to include myself as one of his followers, and I'm sure that we will miss him a lot. And particularly in this moment of all the difficulties that we're facing in the world, we really need some people who have such incisive thinking as John did. So thank you very much, and good luck to everybody.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. You're also being very modest because you achieved an enormous amount in influencing the way that the World Bank addressed all these issues. So thank you very much indeed. It also raised the point about how things might look not so good to begin with, but actually develop into major progressive projects. I suppose the same thing can happen the other way around. I know Forbes Davison and I were talking with a number of you here about doing longitudinal studies of cities that we're familiar with. And I think that is something that to see how things change over time, the point you make there, I think is really very important. So thank you very much indeed. Could I now invite Barry Pinsky to make a contribution, please? Barry, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jeff, and also thanks to Kirti and his team for setting all of this up. I should remind people that I recently retired from my long-standing position as Executive Director of Rooftops Canada. So these are my personal thoughts. I'm no longer speaking on behalf of Rooftops Canada. And I'm going to focus on an earlier period when I was in contact with John. Listening to some of you, I'm quite envious because John and I I guess I didn't really find a way to keep up the contact with John. Like some of you, the first time I ever saw him but didn't meet him was in Vancouver at the UN Conference on Human Settlements in 1976. At the time, I was a graduate architect from McGill University in Montreal. I had worked in a community design workshop, so I guess I thought of myself as a community architect. And the principles we worked on included very important ideas that we shared with John, that people should have a say in decisions that affect them. And everyone, especially low-income communities, deserved access to professional services. This tended to be thought of at the time in terms of doctors and lawyers, but we felt even architects and planners had a role to play and could, in a sense, re-professionalize themselves to work with low-income communities. Keeping in mind the first principle, which is people's say in decisions that affect them. At the time, we helped start the first nonprofit housing co-op in Montreal. And that had support from Canada's National Housing Agency. I'll get back to the co-op housing theme. I also was working on a master's degree in environmental studies, and it focused on urban governance, housing policy, and community participation. So you can see some of the themes that drew me personally to John's work, although, as I said, I didn't meet him one-on-one at the time. About a year later, through a series of accidents and coincidences, I found myself working in Maputo with the National Housing Department, which had been recently formed in the second year of Mozambican independence. At the time, there were only 12 architects / planners working in Mozambique, which was a gigantic country, and at the time had over 10 million people. My work focused on the first large-scale informal settlement upgrading project. I'm not sure we used those words at the time, but we all know what they mean. It was on the very edge of the formal concrete city, the Cidade de Cimento. It involved a very intensive community engagement process in which community played a critical role. Over a number of years, tenure was secured for over 2,000 families. We used pretty low-tech methods compared to the GPS methods that people use now. But in many ways, it was a precursor for UN Habitat's Global Land Tools Network and social tenure domain mapping work that we see all over the world. Over that time, some 10,000 people received very basic services: roads, water, sanitation, and electricity. It was the first of many such projects in sub-Saharan Africa. Not the first, was one of the first, excuse me, and was supported by UNDP. Interestingly, over the next 40 years, the area went from 5% to 90%, over 90% formal housing structures. So many people lived in informal structures made of local materials, particularly reeds, tin shacks. And this was despite enormous poverty in Mozambique. It's probably still one of the 10 poorest countries in the world, and an extensive period of so-called civil war in Mozambique. And even there's been some evaluation of this area, particularly by Paul Jenkins. Some of you will know him, but it illustrates the power of secure tenure and community-led housing. This was really done by people with their own resources. And what unlocked the resource was that they knew they had secure tenure in the area. So sometime in the 1980s, to be honest, I don't know when, I don't know how. It could be one of you helped make the introduction, but I did meet John. And at the time I was passing through London quite a lot, going back and forth to Maputo. And we had a lot of very memorable discussions, at least memorable for me. I think I had more or less reconciled my own thinking about some of the issues that John was always thinking about. The link between the bottom-up, top-down approaches to dealing with problems and left-right kind of paths of development and action. As you can imagine, I remember our discussions as sometimes getting pretty intense and challenging. We were always allies and always in the same broad lines of thinking. But I think we had a lot of disagreements about strategy. Regardless, John was, and usually we met at his place, John was always a very gracious and generous host, as was his wife. He loved to share ideas and debate, and he always left me with things to think about, which is so critical. It's so easy to get into your own thinking, and we always need people like John to challenge our thinking and to push our collective work and thought forward. In the 80s, I was kind of splitting my time between the co-op housing projects in and around Toronto and work in Africa. And in 1985, we launched Rooftops Canada, also known in French as Abri International. And it initially was the international partnership program of the co-op housing sector in Canada. And after a few years, also became that program for the social housing sector in Canada. There's something like 650,000 Canadian households that live in non-profit co-op and social rental housing in Canada. I'd say for the rest of my career, in some ways, our work continued to be influenced by the themes and discussions that I shared with John and with many of you. But John played a critical role as I was sort of shaping my own direction. In Rooftops Canada, most of our partners were trying to combine two things. So they were demonstrating bottom-up human settlement strategies with families and communities on the ground. We worked with housing co-ops in Kenya and a number of other sub-Saharan African countries. We knew, as John pointed out, that housing was not only a process, but an extremely messy process. It's not a linear process in any way. People think it goes from land, infrastructure, build a house, etc. Of course, most people start by building a shack, struggling to get a bit of infrastructure installed. One of the last things they do is secure tenure, and so on. So we know it's a very extremely messy process. And with our partners, we learned more and more how to respond in different ways to that messiness. We also didn't see housing as none of us do, as four walls in a house. It's a much more complicated arena. We started to support housing-related urban agriculture work. For a long period of time, we worked on responses to HIV and AIDS, which was ravaging sub-Saharan Africa. It was the first, major pandemic in the region. Took many, many more lives than the more recent pandemic. Economic and community development, engaging women and youth, all became key elements of the strategies we were developing with our local partners. At the same time, our local partners were engaging politically. I think we all understood that replication required that kind of engagement. Was also necessary to stop evictions in many countries. I remember we supported groups in Cameroon and Kenya. Many of you will know of Mazingira Institute and the amazing work they've done to defend people's land rights. It was also important to engage government to secure land tenure, help access finance, and to push the local and national governments to enable and support urban poor communities with policies, programs, and resources. All too often, we found that governments would put in place policies, but not really follow them up with programs and resources, which is what's absolutely critical to enable low-income communities to undertake projects, urbanization and housing projects that they want. Someone mentioned yesterday the capacity building and John's concern about capacity building. It was always a central theme and strategy of our work. And it wasn't a top-down kind of capacity building as much as possible. It was a horizontal learning and sharing regionally and sometimes interregionally. I remember having exchanges between India and South Africa and so on. A lot of Latin Americans coming to share their experiences in Africa. We worked on capacity building with local partners, most of whom were civil society organizations, community-based organizations, local and national government officials, especially when they were open to that. And I think over time, our work increasingly sharpened its focus on human rights, governance, environment, and gender equality. Rooftops Canada's current work is focused on implementing women's rights to land, housing, and related livelihoods in 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And it combines very practical work at the local level with CBOs, CSOs, and local authorities, with advocacy and policy work at the national level. And I think hearing from Michael and others, this is something we all continue to struggle with. And I think John recognized that challenge of replicability of the approaches that we have been able to develop on the ground. I think we've always thought of our work as pilot projects, maybe not always on the scale of some of Michael's World Bank projects, but I'm sure he would also recognize that many of those were also in a way designed to pilot initiatives in the hope, rarely realized, that they would influence local governments and and just as importantly, national governments. Just to go back to the co-op housing theme, in Canada, the sector eventually grew to over 100,000 households, but was really stymied in the mid-1990s by neoconservative fiscal policies in Canada, which were felt all over the world. And only very recently has our national government re-engaged with new housing programs. It required enormous lobbying by the co-op and social housing sector to get governments to re-engage with housing. And I think there's been an enormous sharpening of the so-called housing crisis, which has never gone away in Canada, but which has been created by an over-reliance on the market and the intensification of the financialization of housing, especially in the private rental sector. I mean, we're all familiar with how market processes are affecting people's lives around the world and how challenging it is to address that, because it requires us to engage with rights issues, fiscal issues, broader concerns that we're not always so comfortable with, especially with a lot of us have backgrounds in architecture and planning. So,
Barry, I think you brought us very well up to date on the issues. So if there's any final concluding comments.
Yes, I mean, I think one, I was going to thank you for your patience. I was afraid I'd go a little bit long. And I also appreciate the opportunity to help remember John's role in building a vision for more inclusive cities in which community-led housing processes have to play a very vital role. So thank you.
Many thanks indeed. You covered some really important points. Could I now invite Peter Ward? Great to be back in touch with you, Peter, after a long time. If you'd like to make your contribution, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and to Kurti for setting this up today. It's great to see you all too. The 1st of November, is the Day of the Dead in Mexico, which is an extraordinarily important occasion for Mexican families to remember and to commemorate those that have passed. So it's especially, I think, appropriate, coincidental, of course, but it's especially appropriate that we should be remembering John Turner today. I must confess that I didn't know John Turner well, having only met him 3 or 4 times. So I would not presume to claim friendship with him, and yet I feel that I knew him intimately through his writings, and had and continue to have, as I'll explain in a minute, huge admiration for his work, his ideas, and his policy advocacy. I must have read, for my research and for my teaching, read and reread and cited all of his published works at some time or other, even going back to his collaborations with fellow anarchist Colin Ward, no relation to me. Unlike many of your contributions, I was not therefore personally influenced by friendship, nor by his obvious charisma, his force of personality, his mentorship of students and collaboration with professional colleagues across the world. in my case. But in 1973, my first encounter with him was as a first-year PhD student embarking on field research into squatter settlements in Mexico City. And I was advised to stop over in Boston. John was then teaching at MIT, to meet with him and several other scholars who were working on informal settlements. With John, it was a short visit. My first experience of a Subway sandwich, seated outside on the lawn at MIT. And in sending me on my way, he encouraged me to get in contact with several colleagues and contacts of students of his in Mexico City, which I duly did. Indeed, Tomás Sudro, who I saw is present today, was, I think, the first person I got in touch with. When I returned to London in 1976, John was then back at the Architectural Association, engaging also with the Development Planning Unit at University College London, where I'd just recently been appointed to a lectureship in geography. So we met a couple of times at that time, and he contributed a chapter to a book that I'd edited called Self-Help Housing, a Critique, in which Jeff and others have chapters. So that was really the sum of my engagement with him face to face. But as I say, I feel as I knew him well through his ideas. And indeed, his early work, the work that he was working on in the 1960s and 70s, really provided an optic for some wonderful lines of inquiry that I was able to pursue and my students were able to pursue subsequently. The idea of consolidation through self-building. And in my case, the idea or thinking about what made for successful, relative success in that consolidation self-building process, given the high level of heterogeneity that one sees within informal settlements at different stages, and indeed between regions. His ideas about housing subsystems and the residential and socioeconomic trajectories for low-income migrants as they go through the life course, as bridgeheaders in the first instance when they arrive in the city, and then consolidators as they move out to the periphery as self-builders. And then third, his advocacy for policies that would be supportive of self-help, the elements, regularization of tenure, provision of infrastructure, and so on, that others have talked about. All of which, by the late 1970s, early 1980s, were becoming much part of the conventional wisdom, as several people have described already. So those are the ideas that really shaped my thinking and my subsequent research. And picking up on some of those threads today, I think Forbes said that, unfortunately, we're not necessarily sort of picking up his ideas as much as we should in contemporary environment. I think one can, and indeed I am. I edit the Latin American Housing Network 9-country study, a collaborative study that I've been coordinating at Texas over the past decade and a half. And this comparative study focuses upon the older informal settlements, in essence, the settlements that were forming in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which are now obviously fully consolidated, extremely densely populated, but after several decades of intensive dwelling occupancy and use, are now often severely distressed, undergoing intense pressure for housing renovation, for retrofitting of services and so forth. So the new policies that we're really having to think about is not so much the upgrading process, but much more that of renovation and housing rehab of the existing physical structure of these homes and settlements. But again, here, I think some of John's ideas are extremely relevant. The ideas of revitalizing community action, the ideas of household self-management and self-building, the ideas of asset management and the maintenance of clean title as these homes pass to their adult children. some 30, 40, 50 years on. All of these are just as part of a raft of new policies, I think, that are required today, and which basically figured in John's basic thesis decades ago. And indeed, a couple of months ago, I was preparing a blog for a webinar set of lectures that we're organizing this fall on the Latin American Housing Network website. And the lectures explore contemporary residential and socioeconomic mobility, and pick up on three of John's early ideas. The idea of spatial trajectories, and the idea of matching housing needs to supply, but now especially for second and third generation adults born in the barrio, the children born of those original pioneer squatters and self-builders. The idea of residential immobility of the original squatter families or owners, so many of whom remain on their lots, now elderly. There isn't the mobility, there's the immobility of those owners. In our work, something like 75–80% of the families we find living on lots have been living there for 25–30 years and so on. The idea that self-building offered a vehicle for upward socioeconomic mobility. He actually got that wrong, I think. We rarely observe upward socioeconomic mobility for the original migrant squatters, although it does create, self-building does create a valuable asset in terms of the housing itself. So the early threads of his work live on, and I think are now can be tested and need to be tested and thought through and explored in the new policy environment that he did so much to change. So those are a few ideas and reflections on my part. I thank you to John Turner for your legacy contributions to our understanding of community and household approaches to housing production, to changing public policy so dramatically in the 1970s and 1980s. And I, for one, will remember you on future 1st of November, Day of the Dead celebrations to do my part to keep your memory alive. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. That's much appreciated. And you mentioned a couple of things which I think all of us need to remember, and that's the spatial process, the bridgeheaders, the process spatially through cities, and also economically and socially. I think in many cases, self-build did help people to improve their economic situation, of course, not everywhere. One other thing you mentioned is you talked about the children of squatters, and I think that process over time is really important. And there's no one better to talk about that than our next speaker, Catherine Golder-Pongratz, because Catherine not only knew John's work intimately, in fact, she's now the holder of his archive in Barcelona, but she kept in touch with him personally extremely well, right up to the very end. In fact, I knew of John's passing from Catherine, and she's been very, very good at keeping in touch, and she's made a film, which she will say all about, and I'd like to pass over to you now, Catherine. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and also Curti for the invitation. And just to begin with, I'm not the holder of the archive. I'm much more the facilitator of someone who has given the archive to the Colegio de Arquitectos in Barcelona, where John's archive is now held, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute. So maybe I would like to share my screen and would like to show you some images, some pictures. I hope you can see well now. And starting out with this image that I very much like, which was given by a Peruvian designer to illustrate the reputations feature that I had written in 2020 in Architectural Review. And I think she really understood through only reading and seeing his picture who John is and what John means, right? As this figure, a bit of a maybe, person related to the stars, to the mountains, a hope figure for the Peruvians who invaded at the time land, like I very much appreciate this depiction of him also as a person who is integrated into a landscape, right? And this is maybe something that is really, we can also learn from him in the sense of understanding him as a holistic thinker. I might just briefly say that I got in touch with him when I was asked to write exactly 40 years before his fantastic 1963 architectural design, to write in AD and to write on Lima, which is the city where I had already been researching and doing my PhD work on. So I got in touch with him through this coincidence, let's say, to think that 40 years after I have to talk to him personally, and that is what started out. So I am probably the person in this digital room that knew him latest only 20 years ago. But we have been establishing really a strong collaboration since then. And what I was doing also, and that was mentioned by Jeff before, this idea of longitudinal work, right? Of looking at the neighborhoods, and you see in this picture exactly the same neighborhood that you saw just a second ago on the architectural design front page. So revisiting the places that John had studied, and together with him, in exchange with him, thinking what has happened in the last 55 years? How has the community developed? And in fact, the first thing, and I very easily understood very soon, that much more than this whole issue about building and constructing, the construction of community was what mattered to him. So these ties that people had brought together, and all of that, these observations that he could make when he was living in Peru, and when he was, let's say, when he was also collaborated to the Peruvian government, that impressed him very much. And maybe Nick, who is also here, will maybe be a bit also speak about his interest later then in his last part of his life in Hastings, where he lived until his death. So to see what he was interested in, these community ties also in his own home community. So I briefly explain about this towards a collaboration that comes through this contact, through also inviting him to Germany at some point, to the art academy where I was teaching. And then when moving to Barcelona, where I live now and where I live since 2006, we've been collaborating together with two other people, Volker Zimmermann and José Luis Ollón, and we have been setting out thinking we want to interview John. So we went to see him in 2011 and did a large interview with him. And what we realized when looking and when talking to him and when asking him questions was his obsession nearly with Patrick Geddes, was his obsession from the very first moment with the thoughts of Patrick Geddes, and with the intention of reinterpreting, really, since having found this notation of life scheme in 1984, when he was 48, sorry, when he was still a student at the Architectural Association. So to re-engage with this all through his life, and to think about a framework that he called a framework for mapping patterns of activities focused on placemaking. So this was the last 20 years of his life, certainly, that he was very much engaged with that and engaged in these issues. And together with Volker and with José Luis, with whom we collaborated with him, really, we set up this kind of working group also together with Kevin, a person who followed him very closely in Hastings, helping him with all the digital issues and with all the programming, etc. So looking into, and this is a screenshot of these working documents, indexing keywords and translating them into primary languages, engaging some students of mine also from India and from Greek. So that was very interesting to work with him in this very complex way that he dealt with things. And then finally coming out with our book. This is probably this is the last publication that John did on a bigger scale, this book published in Spanish, which translates also several of his writings into Spanish, and where we also engage with him in this through the ideas about community making and in this framework idea, in the rereading of Lima's Barriadas out of my perspective, and also his engagement with the Geddesian thinking. So in the Habitat 3 conference in 2016, also an homage to him in some ways, in this pre-publication of the Trialogue journal that I am on the board with, a German journal that also came up in the aftermath, we can say, of Otto Königsberger's influence in the Darmstadt School in Germany. John's ideas were published in English that he also translates into our book, in 2018. And we had the chance, and I'm very happy to see also David Satterthwaite here in the audience, in the digital audience, to present this project in the Habitat 3 conference, and also engage with students, engage with people, and bringing his thoughts into a contemporary context. This was followed up by several events, also at the DPU. This is a very nice image also to see him in 2017 getting back together with me at the time, because we were explaining this project that collaborated really in terms of rereading his thoughts, and was based on a reactivation of urban memory in a self-built neighborhood that he had been looking at in the 1960s, El Ermitaño neighborhood, which I felt the urge nearly to re-engage with when finding it in his archive, this documentary, A Roof of My Own, which thanks to Nick Waits is now also available online, which had then been translated with John's grandson, etc. And I felt that this documentary that talks about or speaks about the history of a person migrating from the Andes to Lima, being supported by the government, and then being able to construct a living and a really making place, has to be returned to the community and has to be followed up in some ways. So in this moment, I decide to bring this film back into the community, to have it been shown in a place that already appears in the documents of John from the 1960s, and then engaging with, I'm just briefly explaining this here, otherwise it would be too long, engaging in the making of a new film with new people from the place that have been living and have been inheriting the place that was built in the years that John has been observing it. And John was part of this project also. This is just a nice screenshot of like introducing him to the team in Lima and having this collaboration on his work and rereading out of our perspective. And the film launch in Independencia 2018. And this is the, let's say, main screenshot of the film, which I will, of course, share with anyone who is interested in to see. And what I am now doing in some ways is, having understood John's interest in Geddes and reinterpreting also this Geddesian way of reading into the neighborhoods that John has been observing 60 years ago, and looking, for instance, at these neighborhoods, at the neighborhood El Ermitaño or others from a holistic perspective, looking into, for instance, how people are changing how people are changing the neighborhoods, invasions, and doing collective placemaking through hill plantations here, as you see in the image, through also an engagement with urban ecology. An issue that I'm really engaged with and where John's thoughts come up with. This is a recent publication about these hidden landscapes of palimpsestic urban memories in this neighborhood that has been explored through the film. And in a way, we can say that in this collaboration with Pablo Vega and with people from Lima, we have been bringing back through our book and then through this journal, Ensayo, in 2021, we have been bringing back John's thoughts into the Peruvian discourse, because we have to understand that he was not only liked, he was also seen as the figure in a way guilty for the development of the barriadas, etc. Helen Geiger also contributed to this journal, who is an excellent scholar and who's written a lot about him in the last years, about his Peruvian years. So in a way, John is being reconsidered in Peru right now, and that brought some late recognitions, which you might not yet have heard about, because they are very, very recent, and unfortunately they came a bit late for John, because he did probably, yeah, he did realize it, but it was too late for him to be able to participate. So, for instance, the Doctor Honoris Causa from the Universidad Nacional de Ingeniería, which was given to him in 2022, and I was bringing him the document in October 2022, and he was clearly happy about it, but it was unfortunately a late recognition. In any case, I think it got to him, and he held it in his hands. And another recognition only this year in 2023 from the Universidad Nacional del Centro del Perú de Huancayo, where he was interestingly nominated at the time, and this is a document on the right that comes from his archive, and I sent to the university, so as they didn't have that. He was the founding dean the Faculty of Architecture. He was nominated as that. He was not. This was in the end not being realized. In any case, he had a huge engagement with this university at the time, and they gave him the Doctor Honoris Causa. So he has now a double degree of honor on his shoulder, which unfortunately, as I say, came very late in his life. And while talking to him in 2022 already, we were having this transfer being made, and John was very much happy about that. I have realized all over the years that one of his major concerns was what will happen to his archive. So we were thinking of what to do. And in fact, the connection to Spain is, of course, because I am there, we are there, who are his late team of collaborators, but also he has a connection. His sister lives in Spain. He has other connections that is related to the language with all his Latin American engagements. So with the Colegio de Arquitectos in Barcelona, I got in touch with them, and they finally agreed, and it is the first international architects archive. And as you can imagine, a very untypical architects archive, because this is not about plans and not about big drawings, but it is all about his documentation on his studies in Peru, and all of his books and everything now being gradually being made universally accessible. And finally being accessible for everyone. And also the classification is ongoing of the materials. Now also we are selecting some key documents, and we are hoping to be able to do an exhibition on all of this most valuable material, which has so much to say for future urbanists, architects, students, and for us in a general sense, thinking about crucial topics that come up all through his documents, right? Planetary organization, decentralization of technology. Also, particularly, I'm interested in the role of women. In this picture, you see his wife, Beth, who was always in a second line, but influential on his work and on the construction, also on Turner's theory on community-led housing. And I would like to end with this quote, which I think is really beautiful and important, and it gives us this idea about his ongoing legacy. So as he says, it is my increasing impression, more a hope perhaps, that interest in nature and community-based principles and practices is growing from a small but ancient base. In fact, I'm sure that it is the only realistic hope for a real civilization. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very, very much for that presentation, Catherine. And I think it demonstrates how clearly that John was mentally active right to the end, and still exploring theoretically the ideas for his framework. And what you've done, Catherine, in protecting his archive and making it accessible, I think is absolutely brilliant. And I strongly recommend anyone who's interested to contact you about your film. I have seen it, and I really, really do recommend it. It's excellent. So thank you very much indeed. Now, our next speaker on my list is Nisar Khan, and he did send me an email earlier saying he was having difficulty logging in. I sent him the new link. Are you there, Nisar, or shall I pass over to the next speaker? I don't see any response. So it would be a great pleasure for me to pass over to a great friend, David Satterthwaite. Pleased to see you there, David. If you'd like to say something, that would be much appreciated. You are muted at the moment. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Jeff, for getting me here. It was a bit complicated finding the right website, but anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I was lent to the Canadian government in 1975 as a kind of young and naive researcher in housing. And they were planning this enormous non-government conference, the Habitat Forum. And they had no program. So they were building these fantastic facilities, but no one to fill them. So being young and naive, I just phoned up John Turner and said, help. And he not only came and organized a series of of workshops and seminars at Habitat Forum. But sorry, what was the other thing I was going to say? No, it's gone. I have Parkinson's.
You organised the event.
Yes.
And gave a keynote speech. Yeah.
Then I went to DPU to do what was then the diploma, and was John's assistant for a short course that he directed. And it was a wonderful 3 months working very closely with John and with a bright bunch of students. And I suppose reflecting on what to present here, I thought I might just identify some issues that were very precious to him and his work, which sometimes we could do with relearning. And it's about choice and dweller control, excellence in housing, the value of housing outside its monetary value, the limitations of money, and mediating structures. We'll just very quickly go through these. When he talked about choice, he was recognizing that one of the great rights of citizens and their organizations is to choose where they live, to choose what they manage, to choose what support they give to collective efforts, and their choice to develop relationships with local government. So here, housing rights aren't things like water and sanitation, but local processes that hopefully will produce water and sanitation. In dweller control, I think we all will recognize the centrality to his work. When dwellers control the major decisions, they're free to make their own contribution to the design, construction, and management. It stimulates individual and social well-being that goes beyond housing. Excellence in housing. Excellence in housing is not produced by centrally administered new housing schemes. It's often the product of decisions by local people carried out by local enterprises. The value of housing that goes beyond its monetary value. John always puzzled us when he said that money is not a resource. But as he developed the thinking about that over time, it's a very powerful point. Oh, yes, the limitations of money. Mediating structures. Communities need stable, non-bureaucratic intermediaries through which the individual can negotiate with a state, can negotiate with central government, can negotiate with local government. He stressed a lot local governance when the market and the state match communities' abilities and needs, then housing needs can be just satisfied. Sorry, I'll read that again. It is only when the market and the state match communities' abilities and needs that housing needs can be satisfied. Of course, he was sometimes accused of focusing only on the local, but he didn't. He recognized city infrastructure needed the large-scale systems into which community and personal priorities can emerge. One of the things that saddens me is that John didn't have the chance to get to know Slum Shack Dwellers International. Ironically, when I invited John to Habitat 1 in 1976, we were inviting a grassroots leader, Jokina Portham. They would have had an interesting meeting between the two of them. And what I see with great pleasure is the extent to which the grassroots organizations and federations are following John's principles and learning strongly from his work. The intermediary structures, the Abika Mashinani Trust in Kenya is a perfect example of an intermediary organization between the state and grassroots organizations. Did Sumsuk speak here earlier? Because I saw her on the list. And of course, the Community Organizations Development Institute that she's developed also meets many of John's requirements for good quality housing. Amazing upgrading done in Gobabis, this small town in Windhoek, where they realized that if they reduced the costs, they didn't need external agencies, and they were very relieved. It's good if you've got your own resources and not have external funding with its strange criteria, its delay, and its Mukuru would have interested John, because this is working with his principles, but on a much bigger scale. 100,000 households in Mukuru, probably the biggest informal settlement in Kenya. There's a lot longer list. In all, we've published 70 papers in environment and urbanization on the work of the federations and the community organizations that are part of the Community Organizations Development Institute. I suppose the final thing I was going to say would be interesting to use John's lenses to see and review these amazing innovations of the last 10 to 15 years. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, David. And you've done an amazing amount to promote the work of not just John, but other community groups and federations in your editing work with environment and urbanization over the years. And we all owe you a great debt for that wide range of information that you've contributed. So thank you very much indeed for that. Now, the next person that we have, you mentioned Somsuk. I haven't seen her on the list. And maybe Kamai could contact to see if she is available. I know the time difference does make it perhaps difficult, but if that is possible, that would be great. Otherwise, I'd like very much to move on to inviting Janice Perlman, who's had a lot of experience on addressing the issues John was addressing in Latin America and elsewhere. So Janice, over to you, please. You are muted, Janice. Janice, could you unmute? You're muted, Janice.
How's that?
That's much better.
Oh, goodness. I'm so happy I could unmute myself. It's a lifelong process of trying to mute myself.
It was good to see you, but it was even better to hear you.
Thank you. I was just really saying that how grateful I was to be part of this wonderful group here of people I love and adore and who've been my comrades in arms for this long struggle of bringing research to apply to changing the world. I want to talk directly to John. John, I want to thank you for inspiring so many of us around the globe, for your commitment to listening to, learning from, and legitimizing the voices of the disenfranchised, for defending people's wisdom in building their houses and communities, and for demonstrating their creative approach to problem solving. That's only part of it for me. My gratitude extends beyond the professional to the personal. Aside from being a role model and inspiration for me, you are my friend and co-conspirator in a lifelong journey. I will never forget your loving kindness in inviting me to dinner in your and Bertha's home with Lisa Petey, who lived next door to you at the time. It was late 1967, and I was on my way to Rio to start my fieldwork in the favelas. You were one of my professors at MIT, and you wanted me to help out a young Radcliffe anthropology student who was planning to write her senior thesis on community organizing in Rio's favelas. I immediately invited her to stay with me when she arrived in Rio several months later, and we have been the best of friends ever since. What a gift. She has been a lifelong friend. She's on the board of the Megacities Project, and she has carried on in her own work through a nonprofit organization, this same John Turner grit and tenacious belief in people. When you were doing your fieldwork in Lima in '63, I was a sophomore undergraduate doing a field study project in rural Bahia, Brazil. Well before meeting you and studying with you, your way of thinking had started to impact me. Later, the idea of following families, when I was there, the idea of following families from fishing and agricultural villages into the city and finding out what happened to them became my doctoral dissertation and reflected my work with you as much as the context of the occurring urban explosion in Latin America. You were a major force in my first book, The Myth of Marginality. And in fact, when I went back to interview those 750 people again 30 years later from those 3 different favelas, one was close in the city and one was in the industrial north and one was in the suburbs. When I came back 30 years later, you were also present in this longitudinal vision. It was in line with your persistent commitment. I found that after all the sacrifice the first generation of migrants had made to come to the city and fight for their communities in order to give their kids a better chance at life, the kids really didn't have the social mobility that the parents had expected. They had more years of schooling, but worse income and worse jobs. But when I went back and interviewed a random sample of the grandchildren, yes, then we could see some of the transfer of being an urbanite for being the third come forth, and about half of those young people had actually gotten some social mobility and had jobs. And even those who had enough money to leave, most of them stayed in the favelas because of that wonderful community and that wonderful sense of belonging and being with people. And as you had predicted, location, anyone who is from the settlement Catacumba, which was nearest to the central city, had a lifetime advantage from those that were located further out. Later, when I gave up my tenure at UCB in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Berkeley to start the Megacities project, it was because I wanted to put into practice this research and make a difference for real people in real time, as you had taught us. It would have been about 25 years or 30 between your books coming out and other books coming out, mine and many people in this room, against the eradication and bulldozing of favelas, until the first full-scale policies for on-site upgrading for sites and services came about. Many of our PhD students had by then become policymakers at various levels. And that became the mission of a Megacities project, to shorten this lag time between ideas and implementation by sharing what worked, by scaling up, by reaching out from these local initiatives. When I chose the coordinators in the first 20 megacities that were going to be running this research action project, almost everyone had been influenced by your ideas. This was in 1987, 88, 89. Calling it a paradigm shift would be a cliche. It was really there. Jorge Wilhelm and Pedro Jacobi in Sao Paulo, Enrique Ortiz, Roberto Ibenschutz in Mexico City, Marlene in Rio de Janeiro, Pablo Gutman in Buenos Aires, Mayan Ignacio in Manila, Darren Dono in Jakarta, Orapin Sapchongshai at TDRI in Bangkok, Om Prakash Mathur, Dinesh Mehta in Delhi, Rahul Malhotra and Sneha in Mumbai, Arif Hassan and Kabzibasha Ahmad in Karachi, Raj Kapoor, Jai Sen in Calcutta. All of these, of course, in Europe and the US, of course. And so many of these people have written to me when I told them about today's meeting and expressed their gratitude to John. And one of the things we have been discussing today is when things get bigger and scale up, power and profits play a greater role. And that's why I think it's been very difficult to go from the neighborhood level to public policy and maintain the integrity of the idea that John had. I was the evaluator of Favela Bairro for IDB 10 years later and 20 years later, and it was very disappointing. In fact, one study by IDB showed that matched pairs of favelas that had Favela Bairro upgrading and those that didn't, the ones that didn't have it were doing better because they hadn't had their expectations raised and they hadn't become abandoned by these raised expectations by a government that no one cared about them once the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure was there. Again, proving John's point that building infrastructure is not building community and not building people. And none of these ideas, including the new PAC in Brazil a couple of years ago, really have the ability to support human beings and community. They find it much easier to have engineers and economists do physical things. So I want to, you all hear about what we can do to continue John's work. We know that there are 3 approaches to dealing with the people in squatter settlements informality. We've done it by territory in our upgrading. There's another approach that does it by a poverty level, like mandatory minimum wage or Bolsa Familia. I was thinking about going to John's ultimate point, which is about rights. The need to fight for the right, not just the right to housing and the right to the city, but the right to be a person whose life matters, the right to be gente, a person worthy of dignity. And so, dear friend, I wish you had lived to see a real shift in perceptions in our planning, practice, and policy. I hope that some of us at this gathering, in your honor, will see it. Without doubt, progress has been made in some areas in some time periods. Process is a dialectical process. After all, we never expected to see the end of apartheid in our lifetimes. It's been a long road with wonderful traveling companions, many of whom are here to honor you. We won't give up on your mission, as they say in Brazil. A luta continua. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janice. A very heartwarming and comprehensive and personal tribute to John. And like you, I also feel very proud to be part of such a network of friends and colleagues that John, in a way, has helped bring together. So thank you very much indeed. Now, Catherine knew John very much in the latter years, but also a neighbor knew him very, very well indeed, and that's Nick Waits. Nick has done a massive amount to promote community planning, did a very good on that. And Nick, you've been very patient. I'd like to invite you now, if you would, to make your contribution. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. Very difficult to follow those wonderful contributions. I'm so happy to have known John as a mentor, friend, and neighbor for almost half a century. He has had a profound influence on my life, which I've spent, with John's help, I should say, practicing and publishing books and websites about community architecture, community planning, and neighborhood regeneration. As well as worldwide respect for John's work, it has also resonated with pioneering UK practitioners, and there's always been mutual respect between John and people like Rod Hackney, John Thompson, and Tony Gibson, for instance. As an architectural journalist, I found myself running into him at conferences all over the globe. The first time being the 1976 United Nations Habitat Conference in Vancouver. I helped John and Beth with editing their 1988 Habitat International Coalition book, Building Community. And later, John and I worked together on a special feature on the communityplanning.net website, making some of his key works available online, including the classic UN TV documentary, A Roof of My Own, which has already been mentioned.
Mr. Tishbandi, could you mute, please?
Hello, shall I continue?
Yes, please continue. Thanks.
In 1985, John and I both attended a black tie dinner at Kensington Palace, hosted by Prince Charles for architectural educators. And later we took part in an intensive community planning event for the Prince's new town of Poundbury in Dorset. It was a mark of his modesty that he was never very comfortable with this flirting with royalty. He was passionate about the community, third sector, and made this clear in everything he said and did. This included his involvement in our hometown of Hastings, where he was an enthusiastic member of Hastings Trust and worked on some great projects, which I could say more about. Above all, I will always value John for his enthusiasm for discussion. He applied wisdom to practical action better than anyone I've ever known. So thank you.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. That's much appreciated, and you're being very modest about your own contribution in this activity. Now, I can hear, I think it's Mr. Deshpande is active verbally on his system. Could I invite you now, please, since you are unmuted already, to make your contribution, Mr. Deshpande? Hello, Mr. Deshpande, can you hear me? I think the dog can hear me. Can you hear me?
नहीं वो इधर पंचायत करने आया था मैं अंकल को जैकेट पहना के हम देख रहे थे क्योंकि केडी ने अभी ऑनलाइन देखा so the model
Kamaya, could you mute Mr. Deshpande? Mr. Deshpande.
42 checks.
Hello, Mr. Deshpande, can you hear me? Okay. Well, since that seems to be a bit of a problem, let me move over and ask if Ashna Singh, who's been very patient, if you could please, Ashna, make your contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Keithy. I actually wasn't sure I was going to be able to attend today, so I wrote up a speech, and I think I will just go through it in the interest of time, and so I won't take too much. So first of all, thanks so much for organizing this and for bringing all of us together. I've only read a lot of your works. I haven't really met you in person. Just to introduce myself, I'm an architect and an urban planner, and I've been working in housing for about 25 years. I've never worked with John really, but I did get to know him a little in personal capacity, and I have learned from him tremendously. I first read John's work as a planning student at MIT in 1998, so much later than a lot of you. And his messages really resonated with me very deeply. They made sense. I didn't realize then that they would be so pivotal in establishing the foundation of my professional career. As chance would have it, I actually met John as a young planner. I was straight out of grad school I was working at PADCO in 2000, that's Planning and Development Collaborative. Some of you may have heard of it. I remember this day very clearly. I was working, it was just another day, and I heard from a colleague that John Turner was going to be coming to visit us. We were working on a project, and he had to provide some inputs on that. And I, being the young graduate, I was so excited. I'd never really met anybody who I had read, whose work I had read. And I had come from India 2 years ago. I had studied, started my new job. And I really couldn't believe my luck. And then given the amount of excitement there was in me, it so happened that a senior colleague, Shari Kessler, I remember, she came up to me and said, John had a dinner with the World Bank today, but it got canceled. So would you like to host him? And I was like, where and how? I had very little money. I didn't know DC. I had a tiny little place. But the thought of having him at my place, I'm like, would it be right? How can I? He's such a big man. And but I did. I mustered the courage. I said, okay, we'll do dinner at my place. And I called Shari and John and a few others and cooked up a small little meal, and it was absolutely wonderful. He was so so kind, so humble, just easy. We had a really good conversation, and I'll never forget that evening. Then we decided we would stay in touch, and about 8 years later, we didn't really communicate, but I was writing a book. A lot of my work in the meanwhile was It was very field-based, and every time I interviewed people, I think I didn't connect the dots at that point, but I look back and I'm like, I think a lot of it really came from the work that he did. It was very ground-based and community-based. So in 2008, I was co-authoring a book focused on community-driven development and was trying to find someone to write the foreword for it. And I thought, who better than John Turner? We had not been in touch for 8 years, but I did remember that John had given me a little piece of paper. He'd written his address on a little piece of paper. And I was quite sure, I'd moved house. I wasn't sure I was going to find it, but I sort of rummaged through stuff and I was able to locate it. I still have it here. I don't know if you can see this. So he wrote his address down, and I guess I'm one of those sentimental types. I kept this. I contacted him. I think a lot of the numbers were outdated. It wasn't the time of Google at that point. So we sort of, sent him emails at every address that we could find, and me and my co-author. And to our surprise, to my great surprise, he actually responded a few weeks later. And he did agree to do the foreword. But there's one thing he did say, which made me a bit sad. He said, to quote, "I hope it will do you more good than harm. My embarrassment is from the 20 years barren of works of interest to my readers." That was really pretty sad. And he, given how vast his contribution has been to bettering the lives of so many. And to this, I will say the development, as other people have mentioned today, the development community of today is not the same as it was 30 years ago. Several people mentioned students not knowing John Turner's name, but also the large IFIs like the World Bank, where I worked for about 7-8 years until recently. I can say with some level of confidence that community-driven work is largely in name, and work in the housing sector has been moving further and further away from bottom-up and the self-help approach that John espoused. As someone mentioned here, the financialization of the housing sector. Since the publication of my book in 2009, John and I kept in touch. It was more at a personal level. We would exchange emails once in a year, once in 2 years. And Catherine's presentation reminded me, he had actually sent me a draft of the paper revisiting Patrick Geddes' paradigm. And he asked for comments. At that time, a lot of it went over my head, and I actually told him that. He said, "I want to get your opinion." And I said, I think this is very technical for me. I'm not sure I understand all of it. And he said, "That's exactly what I need to know." So I gave him my comments. I was amazed that he would even contact someone like me, but I did. And then in 2010, he sent me a copy of the draft paper, and he said, "Thanks a lot for your inputs." Again, just goes to show what a kind and great and humble human being he was. And then, of course, we would communicate off and on. And then I learned from a friend that he passed because the last year or so, in 2020 was my last communication. He sent an email saying he hadn't been keeping very well during COVID. And that was the last I heard from him. So I'll go to say that as we celebrate his life, I think it is critical that we continue his legacy, both in terms of disseminating his work and in incorporating his principles in the work we do. The need is greater today than ever before, particularly in the context of climate change that is rendering so many communities and so much more vulnerable than before. In terms of housing specifically, there's a lot to talk about building climate resilience, but there's a huge gap when it comes to climate adaptation for communities living in informal housing. I've spoken to many people about this. What can we do to help informal sector, people living in informal housing, to at least get them to be stronger and more resilient? But there really is a huge gap in this area. And we can discuss this later. I will close by saying that the great John Turner, through his humility, kindness, generosity, and passion for the work he did, not only influenced my thinking, but also shaped my purpose and attitude to development practice. I know he did this to many across the globe, and I hope we can pass his legacy to future generations. So thank you, John Turner, and thank you all for the opportunity to pay tribute to a great thinker, a mentor, and a friend.
Thank you very much, Asna. Much appreciated. You make some really important points there. And it is sobering to think that in some areas the challenges of community involvement are getting more and more difficult. Now we've got one more presentation on my list, and that's by Vijayadhar Deshpande. Now I see you are on screen, so could I invite you to unmute and make your contribution, please? Mr. Deshpande? Yes, could I invite you to contribute? No. Yes. Mr. Deshpande, do you wish to contribute? Well, I'll let him come in if he wants to. Can you hear me, Mr. Deshpande? I'm getting no visual response. So what I'm going to do very quickly is to just read out a couple of messages which we received. One from Alonso Ayala Alaman at IHS, who regrettably was unable to contribute in person because of an accident to one of his family members recently. He wrote to say that he was born in Caracas, Venezuela, when he also studied architecture. And anyone who knows Caracas will have seen pictures of its barrios. Estimates claim that 40% of the urban population of Caracas live in barrios. And these are mostly built by self-help efforts without any help from the public sector. And so his awareness of John was through the work of housing by people. And he was very, very involved and interested in the concept of housing as a verb. He says, it might sound that I was being superficial or even frivolous in my understanding of housing. But to be honest, architects at that time were trained not to concern so much the interests of people, but to create masterpieces, which if they were lucky enough would be something to be achieved by their 50th year. So he says that goal is long overdue of being achieving his objectives at the age of 50. But here he is talking about the fact that he's still able to do much more to translate people's agency in housing into meaningful policies and strategies, which can unlock their potential towards full realization of their right to adequate housing. This change of his goal as an architect was influenced totally by John Turner's work, and also some scholars who were inspired by John himself, so directly or indirectly through John. And he says that the training of architects, especially in what we call the Global South, needs to emphasize this social role and make them more aware of the reality of their context. So thank you very much indeed for that one. I've also got some comments by Christopher Benninger, the well-known architect, who says he first met John in October 1966 when he was at the Joint Center for Urban Affairs, and he was designing a self-help housing project at Harvard, where he was a master's student doing a study on the barrios of Medellin, where his father was setting up a college. He became close friends at that time, and a year later followed John to MIT. There he also contributed to his book on dwelling urban environments, doing research on El Ermitaño, north of Lima, which is the area that John had studied, in which Catherine also followed up with her film. In 1973, Christopher moved to the School of Planning in Ahmedabad, which he founded, and spent a month running a workshop and seminar, and invited John again to his institute in Pune in 1984. Christopher used to stay at John's home in London, and it was a lifelong student-guru friendship. His thesis at Harvard became the basis of his self-help shelter project, funded by the World Bank and implemented in Chennai by the then Maharashtra Metropolitan Development Authority. So he was very, very grateful to all the help and support that he had received from John. So I don't think anybody else wants to say anything. Thank you all very, very much for those excellent presentations. There is a few minutes if anyone would like to add anything to what has already been said. Any final contributions?
I'd just like to say thank you, Jeff and Kirti, for organising this. It's been fantastic.
Well, it's really up to Kirti, whose idea it was, and he's done all the work with his with support from Kamaya. So thank them very, very much. I think we would like to end this seminar with a few thoughts about going forward. Kirti and I would like to say a few words about what we think might be ways forward. Can I pass over to you, Kirti, to initiate that? You need to unmute, Kirti.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep, can hear you now.
Yeah, I think I think that we need something more substantive on John Turner's, besides these reflections and storytelling. This has been immensely useful, but we require much more than that. Because though he was a visionary and a great original thinker, John is the figure of the last century. We cannot run away from that fact. Young people do not know him. Believe me, young architects and planners have not even heard about him, but that's also a fact. And I'm talking about the Indian context. And I'm not surprised at all that as a group of postgraduate students and planning in Pune last month, when I was with them and asked them about Mahatma Gandhi on the day of Gandhi's birthday, they couldn't say really much. So if Mahatma Gandhi could be forgotten, there is no reason why John Turner will not. So what we're thinking is this, that we should consider reproducing, repackaging, and reinterpreting John Turner for the new generation. And the new urban context in the world that we see now. Community, poor, land, real estate, slums, housing, market economy, climate change, and even the housing right need to be seen in the present day context. And that obviously requires new responses, especially as homelessness and affordable housing are big challenges even today, and the people's role in housing can never be undervalued. So it is in this context, we are essentially suggesting three things. One is this, that we organize a few webinars on reinterpreting, rethinking John Turner in the new urban context in the world. And this is possible, as a matter of fact, this particular meeting we are organizing because we, INHAF organization with which I am working, have been organizing webinar on urban theme for last 2 years. As a matter of fact, this is 97th webinar on one theme that is called Rethinking City. And there has been a tremendous amount of response to what is happening. So what one thought was this, that if you could organize a few more webinar meetings, some very bright people involved in this, they are here on this platform, we could really kind of think into how do we take this idea further. So that is the one idea. Second idea that has come from the webinar series is also something we did last year. We, as I said, have been organizing about over 90 webinars, and we use that opportunity to produce one book already, and 2 books are in the pipeline. And let me kind of tell you a little bit more about this. We organized, as a part of this webinar series, 3 webinars on Conservation and Indian City. And it was so well done that the two anchors who were organizing this took promises from 20 participants that they not only come and participate in the webinars, they also write 1,500 word essay on the given subjects. Each one of them followed, and we already have a very beautiful book called Conservation and the Indian City, Bridging the Gap. We also now working on the second book and the third book. So what I'm suggesting is this, that we use those few webinars we organized in order to put together a book in the new context of urbanization, cities, communities, and housing. So this is the kind of two suggestions that we have. We discussed this. Jeff, if you wanted to add something, but let us put this on the table and see how could we kind of take it further. Let's hear views from the people who we have at the moment in this meeting.
Well, thanks very much, Kirti. And just to follow up on that, as you suggest, my own thought was that a book might be a very appropriate way of taking the issues forward that John was addressing. And just looking around the screen, at the collective age of all of us, we've probably got about a millennium of experience, which I think we should try and draw on, both to reflect and to look forward. My own thought, when I was discussing this yesterday with Kirti, was that if we had a book called something like Community-Led Development, Past, Present, and Future with a question mark, that might be something which would enable us to look back, address the current issues, and speculate about the possibilities for the future. So a three-part book looking at the past, present, and future possibilities with a question mark, as I say, of community-led development, because John wasn't just looking at housing. As far as I feel, housing was his vehicle for a much wider, bigger ambition for development itself. And, you know, when one looks at what we mean by development, all it seems to amount to in such so many media outlets is growth. More growth, more growth. Growth is the answer. And we quite obviously live on a planet with finite resources. We cannot keep growing. We do need to live within the planetary boundaries. I'm a great subscriber to the donut economics theory of Kate Raworth, where we have to bring those who are under-resourced, underprivileged into the ring of the donut, but bring those who are consuming and polluting too much back within it. And that means redistribution, not growth in itself. So, you know, what is the role of communities in development? And I'd like to think that it isn't just community-led housing we're going to be concerned about. We've all of us collectively in this network, have got a wealth of experience on diverse aspects of the process. And it's a wonderful opportunity, I think, for all of us to think about what we could contribute, what we would like our legacy to be, building on that of John's, using John as the prototype, if you like, or the model, or the mandate, and seeing if we could produce a book that draws on our own collective experience and takes things forward and communicates that to the next generation. Thanks very much. So I've said my bit. Please could I pass over to anyone else who'd like to speak?
Jeff, it's Tony Lloyd-Jones. Can I just raise a word that we haven't really heard much about, which is migration and refugees. I'm working in Somalia at the moment, or not in Somalia, but on Somalia, where cities can double in size within a few months because of internally displaced people. And this is an issue that's going to get more and more on our plates, and is something that we need to bring into the debate. We don't have time to talk about it. There's all kinds of issues around refugee camps that I wouldn't even want to raise now because I'm so angry. But can we include that in the agenda? Just to say, it's fantastic to see the network that John has, all kinds of people who I've never met but have had an influence on my work, you know, just extraordinary. I feel very privileged to have been part of this. Thank you very much for organizing it.
Thank you very much, Tony. No, you're absolutely right. And, you know, migration levels are already causing a political, political frenzy, I suppose. And it hasn't even started in terms of what's going to happen when the climate crisis really takes hold. So, no, absolutely right. That's why I think maybe talking about community-led development rather than just housing might be very relevant. Someone else would like to contribute, please.
Jeff, can I just make a quick comment?
Please.
People are increasingly not reading books. And when Springer produced a volume recently, which I thought looked interesting, they wanted £300 for it. Now, open access journals, we have 600,000 downloads of papers every year. Our blog series has 400,000 readers. We haven't tried, what's it called, where you have a spoken presentation. They're not called blogs, they're called something.
Podcast.
A podcast, yes.
Yeah.
Podcasts. And these, I think, fit more with, and when I chat to students, that's what they're reading more and more.
That's a very good idea, David. Would one option be for all of us to have a WhatsApp group or a network where we could share ideas for taking this forward, do you think? Kirti, would that be something you could facilitate?
Yeah, of course. That's very good. Yeah, thank you, David. It's a very good idea.
Very good idea. Yeah. Anyone else want to?
Can I just make a suggestion? You know, you've been talking about sharing the experience that we have, but I think a really important thing would be, if we take this forward, is trying to link it up with younger generations, so that developing things together and getting that sort of connection. In a way, that's something that John was also very good at doing. He had great ideas, but he was also excellent at linking people and linking through generations. And I think that's something that we could pick up from that. In practical terms, it could be helping, say, younger people in universities doing research which brings up to date some of the experiences that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Very good.
Catherine.
I just wanted to add to what Tony Lloyd-Jones was saying about refugees. Very interesting, because the last times with John, and even now when John was no longer so actively contributing to conversations with Beth, with his wife, we were speaking a lot about what impact his thoughts and his ideas have or should have or could have, or what would it bring to the current situation and the really refugee crisis. So I think this would be very important to check on John's ideas with regards to refugees, as was suggested. And I also agree with David on the fact that students, and I'm trying to engage students, and I do engage students also with John's thoughts, but it is true that they would rather not read the books, or they would rather opt for looking into websites and into other things. So the film, for instance, is a very good method also to bring things across. But I agree that that we have also to be opening up some other probably platforms. And Nick Waite's community planning website is pretty good at that, also at gathering some of the documents that John has written. But I mean, this is just getting in touch with his original work. But I think I very much embrace the idea of going forward and updating John's thoughts into the current situation. And I feel somehow also, even it's my depth to do so. I feel like he has often spoken so much to him, and he has also given us his legacy on the one side, but also the duty to continue his work. Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this meeting.
Geoff, before we wind this up, Geoff, is there some kind of confidence of silence between you and Thomas Sudra? It's not spoken anything. Thomas, you don't want to say anything, or is that
who? Sorry.
Yes. Yes.
Thomas Sudra.
Thomas, yes.
Yeah, from Nairobi.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to add a couple of things which maybe were missing talking about John and his contribution. And the first one is his collaboration with Ivan Illich and the Center of Intercultural Documentation in Cuernavaca in the beginning of 70s. I had an opportunity to be involved there as well in some teaching there and with John. And I would say that John's housing by people and the whole approach of user-centered thinking about housing and community-based development very much parallels what Ivan Illich contributed in Deschooling Society, in the discussion of the future of education, and Medical Nemesis in discussion about future of medicine. And I would think that here I'm linking to what Geoff has mentioned a moment ago, is that we should look at John's contribution not only in area of housing, but beyond that as well. I don't know if I'm not losing. Am I still there, or I'm losing the connection? Hello?
No, you're still here.
No,
I'm still there. Okay. The other thing maybe is worth mentioning that the thoughts and approach of John went also quite strongly into the work of UN Habitat in Nairobi. And from the beginning of the first Habitat conference in 1976, where I was with John as a part of Mexican, in fact, NGO delegation there, up to not much that 10 years ago, the development of guidelines for governments, that's one of the functions of Habitat, on approaching issues of low-income populations, housing, and the whole issue of development problems related to it. The thoughts of John were very much part of the work that Habitat was developing. I won't expand on it further. I was involved in it myself in 2013 for the last time, together with Mohammed Al-Sufi, who was also one of the John's students and then head of the housing branch. And definitely, if one looks at documents of UN Habitat at that time with guidelines for governments, then a lot of John's thought is reflected in it. The other question is how effective it was as a tool of influencing what's happening on the ground, but that's another issue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Thomas. Thank you. Kirti, do you want to wrap up?
No, I don't want to wrap up. The only thing is this, that you call Miss Vidyadhar Deshpande twice.
I did
I
ask
still see
to call.
yeah,
I did ask him if he wanted to speak, but he.
Vidyadhar sir, you want to say something? Deshpande sir, you want to say something? Okay, something is wrong, I think, with the system.
Yeah.
No, so there is nothing more. I think we put to kind of thank you, and I really wanted to kind of use this opportunity to thank my colleague here and Bhumaji in extending enormous amount of help in organizing this. It's not been easy. It's not been very simple, and there have been, I think, a lot at work. And of course, I must thank Geoff, you enormously, because all the support, all the guidance, all the contacts and all that you made have been extremely well useful in getting something like 40 people to come and participate in this 2 days event. And we are not saying goodbye today. We are saying there is something that will follow subsequently, and we will let all of you know, and then kind of see how we will take it further. So thank you very much. Unless you want to say something, George, before we wind this up.
Yeah, Jeff, could I just add a couple of words?
Sure.
Yeah. No, I particularly was interested in what David Satterthwaite was saying, that people don't read books these days. But through his experience of IID, there's a very large following. And I regularly read the blogs. But how do I find out about it? I find out about them through LinkedIn. And then there's a connection. And I think it would be good to have some discussion with David as to what sort of format we could use to make sure that there is a wider participation and wider audience for this extremely important work. And I think sort of things that you and Kati have been saying, I fully support. Question is, what is the best way of doing it so that these views and information becomes widely available? And I think David has a lot of experience, and it would be good to draw on his experience of what kind of media is the best way forward to do this. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree, Mike. It's a very good point. And I'll be seeing David soon. So I'll take that up with him and keep in touch with Kirti. If Kirti can keep in touch with the whole network that's been involved in these webinars, then we can collectively find a way forward. But it's been great to be in touch with you all. I do feel honored, and it's been an immense pleasure seeing so many familiar faces and new ones, and being in touch. So thank you all very much. Well done, and thank you, Kirti and Kimaya.
Thank you very much. I think everyone, I think it's been great to have you here, and it's been very useful. It's wonderful, very inspiring, and done a great deal. Thank you. Also, I must say, I'm sorry that Arif Hassan was supposed to be on today. He's not well, he couldn't come. So I got a message from him saying that, please tell that everyone that we wanted to come. He's not able to come. He looks forward to seeing the recording of this event. And he said, he will come back after that. So, but thank you very much for all of you being here. It's been a long session. It's almost about 2.5 hours. And you people are not accustomed to such long sessions. We in India are. But so thank you for staying back. And thank you for your tremendous contribution. We look forward to kind of continuing this process. Thank you very much.